Hey everybody, I hope you are staying well and healthy and creative during these times. I just wanted to talk about my process as a composer and as a beat maker. Yesterday was the 42nd edition of Loop Sessions Montreal. Loop Sessions is an initiative started in Sao Paulo at Casa Brasilis and exported to Montreal by Lou Pienza and Dr. Mad. There are now editions all over the world, and most of them are happening still at home. I went to a couple of the in-person sessions back in the day, but I have been integrating the at-home editions as part of my artistic practice during this quarantine. Especially on yesterday's loop sessions, I realized how close my beat making and my composing processes are linked, and how similar my philosophies of both composing and beat making are. So perhaps if you're a beat maker and you want some different ways to think about your process, hopefully this will help. If you're a composer and you want to think about record production or beat making, maybe this will offer you a way in with the skill set that you already have. First, I'll talk about the philosophies, and then we'll dive into the logic sessions of the 4 beats that I made. The beats will be in a SoundCloud playlist that will be linked below in the description box. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please click like and subscribe. Please follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Ryshpan Music. And if you're feeling really generous and you are in a position to do so, please go over to Patreon, where you can get exclusive content, exclusive PDFs, support the channel, help it to grow, and allow me to do more of this. One thing that I find really important and helpful, whether it's in composition or in beat making, is the idea of limitations or parameters. This was inspired by trumpeters Michael Phillip Mossman and Dave Douglas, both of whom I had the pleasure of attending lectures and classes by. And both of them basically talk about setting up a series of questions or a series of limitations, a series of parameters before you even start writing the music. And this is, I guess, similar to DJ Premier or J Dilla, who hear the beats in their heads before they start making the beat, and then they just find the samples that they need to bring the beat into fruition. I'm going to paraphrase what Michael Mossman's ideas were, but he has a whole list of criteria and questions that he asks himself before he even starts writing an arrangement or a composition. Things that are as basic as what ensemble is it for, what's the instrumentation, what are the available woodwind doubles in the saxophone section, does the bass player also play electric bass, like what is available to you for this ensemble, and is it a commission, is there a time expectation, is there a time constraint? So for example, in loop sessions, they want your beat to be 1:30, 90 seconds. So off the top, you don't have to ask yourself, how long does this beat have to be? You know it has to be 1:30 seconds or less. So then the work becomes, how can I condense or fit the ideas that I'm having, the ideas that are inspired by the provided record? How do I fit that into the framework of 1:30 seconds? And I find having those parameters, those limitations, those criteria defined before I start to write focuses the way that I write, focuses the way that I produce. There are still a ton of variations possible within those fixed criteria, but at least I've defined whatever frame that I need to define, so I'm not stuck with option paralysis. The next thing I want to talk about that might be counterintuitive or might seem contradictory to what I just spoke about is the idea of generating as much material as you can. And I learned this from John Hollenbeck, the great drummer and composer, who promotes this idea of generating as many possible variations and ideas from your initial seed as possible, and then you kind of edit later. And a lot of musicians and composers that I work with, the generator brain or the composition brain is separate from the editor brain. And I think in production and beat making, you can apply this as the creation brain. The creative brain is separate from the mixing brain or the editor brain. When I'm editing, I go in with a different mindset. I'm being as objective as I can about my own work and about the mix, and having to admit that it doesn't work or it doesn't achieve what this piece or this beat is meant to achieve. And it's not a personal put down or insult to say that it doesn't work. It's not a comment on my creativity or my humanity. It's just an admission that for this project, for this piece, for this beat, for this artist, whatever it might be, that decision didn't work, that move didn't work. Additionally, what I'm using the loop sessions for is a way to really discover my software, discover my plugins, discover different ways of approaching sample-based music. One of the people in the loop sessions Instagram hang last night said as much that, after 4 months of quarantine, I'm sick of my sounds, I'm sick of my production choices, I'm just tired, I'm kind of creatively stuck. And if you go in with the curiosity and the discipline of what have I already done on a loop sessions beat, and so I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to avoid doing that. That'll be sort of my last resort, or if the sample inspires me to do that, then I'm not going to rule it out, but it won't be my first method of creation or method of attack. So in the 4 beats that I've done so far, I've tried really hard to diversify how I approach the samples. And obviously, upon hearing the samples, that kind of dictates where you're going to go and what your options are, the same way the first musical phrase you come up with as an idea as a composer will kind of dictate where that music wants to go. So that's enough of the philosophy. I think that kind of sums up where my headspace is at, both in composition and beat making. So now let's look at the sessions, and I'll show you what I did and what I was thinking about. All right, so this is the first session I did. I'm not going to name the records because I don't want copyright strikes. Obviously, you can maybe see in the track lists the names of the tracks. You can maybe go on Discogs and figure out what the record is. So for this one, I did a lot of very intense sample chopping. So what I did was I loaded it into I work in Logic X, and so I loaded the track into EXS24. And if you go into the editor, basically this is like an old school Reason kind of sample slicing idea, where I just chopped a bunch of the samples into one-shots and assigned it across the keyboard for 1.5 octaves. So that was a ton of different slices, and I replayed these slices as their own newly constructed pattern. So this was the most maybe chopping that I did for any of the 4 beats, and you'll see in the intro I reversed some of the samples inside EXS. So I reversed whatever the slice is on F4 is reversed. So the intro was kind of based on that reversed sample. And then I have some more chops for the intro here. I also took a horn stab from another track of the record and overlaid it with the chops. It seemed to work. And then this is just kind of bells or sound effects that I'm running through a bunch of different effects, like a massive reverb and then like a glitchy stutter edit kind of thing. So what I did for this was I worked on the samples first. I got the chops happening, and then I built the drums around the way I chopped the sample. And so what do we have here for drums? I have two different kits happening. And so the battery kit is the primary drum source, and then I've supplemented it with additional kicks, additional hats, additional claps, and a little bongo loop, or a fragment of a bongo loop that I'm running through a filter. The only other thing I did additionally was just putting some extra sub bass, because I cut a lot of the low end out of the samples, so I wanted to put it back with my own bass line that matched the way I chopped those samples. So that was what I did for Loop Sessions 39. It was very sample heavy, very chop heavy. So here's Loop Sessions 40, which was done on Saint Jean Baptiste, the Quebec holiday. And so they chose a Québécois record. This was like a progressive rock record. And now you'll see that I have multiple samples from different tracks on the record. Actually, only 2 tracks, but I'm using them a little bit differently, and I haven't chopped them as much. So I definitely wanted to avoid doing the same thing I did on Loop Sessions 39. So you'll see I have sort of a primary loop. I have sort of a response to that from a different track. You'll see I'm also playing piano on this. The first loop session, I really wanted to just use the samples. I didn't want to play, or only wanted to play as little as possible, and really work with the samples. That was kind of the challenge to myself. And on this one, I allowed myself to play a little bit more. Again, I think I worked with the samples first and got the samples in place, and then programmed the drums and then played everything else over it. That's kind of my general method of working in sample-based music, is get the samples chopped up first and then get the drums around it and then play on top of the drums. Again, pretty minimal drums here, 2 hats, a clap, kick, snare, and a shaker, samples, piano, synth bass, and synth bass that I'm bussing out to a bass amp plug-in to kind of get it to cut on smaller speakers. So not a ton happening here. A variation on my method of working on the previous beat. And of course, because the samples are so different, then they're going to lead me down a different creative path. So on this one, this was a library record that was provided, and there were no drums. And it was just a lot of synth hooks. So what I did was I took a pretty small part of a synth hook and used that as the centerpiece, but you'll see I'm playing a lot more original material over it. So I have multiple keyboards, I have 2 different bass patches, and I actually have 2 different drum grooves. A lot of people in the previous two loop sessions were doing sort of multiple beats inside of a minute and a half, and I was really inspired by that. So I was on this. That was a parameter that I set up for myself as well, was that I wanted to have 2 parts to this beat, because I was inspired by other people doing that. And what you'll notice is I also have all 3 of these beats have this reverb on it, Native Instruments Round, which I absolutely love. I think it's amazing for sound design and for mangling your samples and your sounds. But as you'll see in the next one, in the one we just did yesterday, I didn't use it, and I didn't have an intro, or I didn't have the same type of intro, because I realized as I was producing that I had done 3 beats in a row with these kind of spacey, weird sound designy intros, and I didn't want to do that. I felt like I was starting to repeat myself. Yeah, I was starting to repeat myself, and so that was a parameter I set myself for Loop Sessions 42, is to not have a spacey, weird intro and find a different way to get into the beat. So you'll see here, same kind of minimalist drums, kick, snare, clap, hats, 2 sets of hats, percussion, and then siren sound effect that seemed to work with the sample that I'm running through a bunch of effects. And then here's my 2 synth bass tracks, my different keyboard tracks. This lead, basically there was a part of the sample that didn't fit tonally, or I wanted to include a line that sounded like it was a continuation of the sample, but it's not from the original record. So I programmed this synth to match the sample as closely as I could. And then here's the 2 tracks. This is the main sample. These are like the intro effects. And then I threw on a little a cappella sample that I had. Shout out to Wally from Nomadic Massive. And I tend to like bussing out my elements. So you'll see I have a drum bus, a bass amp bus, which is this aux, and then a keyboard bus. I just find it helps to get everything to cohere together. And so now here is the most recent Loop Sessions beat. This is from yesterday. The provided record was a pretty classic record. I'll let you figure it out from the track names. And this one was tough for me because it's a record I love a lot and has been sampled and covered a ton. So I wasn't really sure what to do. And so this is what I wound up with. I combined 3 different tracks from the album and transposed them so that they all wound up working in the same key, and time stretched them so that they were all at the same BPM. And then I allowed myself to play more. So I'm playing additional Rhodes with effects, and again sub bass to just kind of fill out the bottom because I scooped out the bottom of a lot of the samples, and went heavy on the drums and used a different drum machine. I had been using Native Instruments Battery a lot in the past just to kind of familiarize myself more with its sounds and with the workflow of Battery. But then I rediscovered Arturius Spark, and I felt like it seemed to work better for the vibe I was going for on this beat. So I used mostly Arturius Spark with some stuff from Native Instruments Battery as well. I know I could probably load it all into Spark, but just in my brain it made more sense to have 2 separate drum machines. And you'll notice there is not really an intro. At least there's no intro full of spaciness. There's me replaying a track from the record on Rhodes for 2 bars. So it's a very short intro, and then we dive straight into the beat. And then instead of an intro, we have an outro that is a little more spacey. No 2-part beat here. It's just kind of developing the main loop. So you'll see that this sample only comes in halfway through. The Rhodes part, I originally played this 4-bar loop first and then chopped it into a 2-bar section to repeat, to just allow the beat to develop a little bit more inside of a very tight kind of loop-based framework. This is probably the most kind of old school beat that I did, and it's the closest to me, it's the closest to the actual provided sample. I didn't transform anything so much. I just kind of transposed and time stretched everything for it to work together. But the base material is all from the provided record. So that's it. I hope that helps everybody watching this video. I hope the compositional philosophies help beat makers maybe break out of their boxes and think a little bit differently about the way that they approach the art of beat making, and hopefully the different levels of making a beat, programming, listening to the sample, chopping up the sample versus editing and mixing. Hopefully those sort of split brains will help composers in how they approach their own compositional work. Again, please click like and subscribe if this video was useful to you. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Ryshpan Music. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm less active on Twitter, same handle. And if you're feeling generous, go over to Patreon. There's PDFs, there's additional blog posts and DJ mixes and all kinds of good stuff. It helps support the channel, it helps support me, helps create even more content for everybody who needs it during this time. Please stay safe and healthy and creative. Wear a mask, stay at home as much as you can, and keep making music. Peace.